Hi. Don't know what I'm doing. Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Simon and today I'm back with a penultimate video of the 5 days of videos in a row to celebrate belatedly celebrate my 5th BookTube birthday, which was last Friday. And today I'm going to be doing the books that shaped me / reading through the years. And I nearly said tag video because it is a kind of unofficial tag video is what I'm going to say, is that if you would like to have a go at this, basically I'm going to go through each of the decades of my life and pick some books that have really meant something to me. Now, this was initially inspired by a lovely man called Dan, who asked me if I could do a video on books that have sort of changed my life in any way. Like, say, for example, he's just recently read some books that have stopped him eating meat. And I was looking back and thinking, I don't think there's been anything like that necessarily, but there are definitely books that have kind of built me as a person or that have meant to me a lot over the years and are sort of part of my, I don't know, what's the word, being, really. Certain books that really stick. And they're not necessarily my favourite books of all time. They're just books that have meant a lot at certain points. And so I thought I would have a chat about those. And if you would like to do the same, please do pick. There's no rules as to how many per decade. Just pick which ones really stand out for you. For example, there's one decade where I only had 3 because I didn't read for most of that decade, but we'll come back to that shocker later. So there we go. It's a kind of unofficial tag. If you want to have a go, do it and let me know by linking it in the comments down below, because I would love to see lots of you do it. Right, on with the book. So, itchy nose always happens in my videos. I am going to start off obviously with my first decade, so from when I was 0 until I was 10. And the first books that probably had the most lasting effect on me, even though they might not have been the first books that I read, were the books that my granddad made me. So my granddad, I didn't call granddad, I called him Bongi. And this is the first of them, The Marvellous Adventures of Esmeralda, Marmalade and Mitch. And Esmeralda was a witch, Marmalade was a cat, and Mitch was a mouse. And eventually they have some duck friends and some chicken friends, and they have a friend called Simon and all of his friends. And my granddad used to make these for me when I was living in Newcastle with my mum while she was at university. And they would arrive like once a week. I'd get a new one, and it was just so lovely. And I've got a whole set of them on shelves over there that you can't see. But these are also some of my most precious books, but these definitely kind of really got me into reading. And not in like, I mean, you can't be egotistical at the age of 3, but like, not just because I was in the books, because I wasn't to begin with, but just because they were so beautifully done and so nicely illustrated. I mean, look at that, it's just very cute. They're all on the bus and then they're making sandcastles and anyway, so yes, these books definitely meant a lot to me. When I was thinking about what the first book I can remember reading, it's a very apt book, and I was talking about this not long ago with my mum, because really this book influenced my entire life in ways that I would not have expected at the time. And that is Elmer by David McKee. And the reason that this book, I think, really sang to me was the bright colours. I absolutely love bright colours. If you've seen any pictures of my house on Instagram and stuff, you will know every room is a colour, except for one room. We have one white room in this house, which is Chris's housekeeping room, because Chris, when I met him, had like a predominantly white and grey house until I arrived. Anyway, so the other thing about this whole book that I don't think I realised even till very recently was about kind of Elmer being different and wanting to be like everyone else, and yet actually when he became like everyone else, him just sort of fitting in with the mould and then being celebrated once they realised that he was back, and his difference being celebrated. So there's a lot of sort of stuff, I guess you could say, about acceptance and being different, and obviously all the bright colours. And I think it just turned me into who I am, because right now, you know, I'm quite different from other people, being part of the LGBTQIA plus community, plus just everyone's different anyway, aren't they? Because you're you. And I really love a bright jumper. And I think it all is deeply rooted in Elmer. I seriously think that. And I've got an Elmer t-shirt on the way, apparently, which I'm very excited about and will be wearing in many a video coming soon. So yeah, this I just love. I think it's such a joyous, hopeful, celebratory book about difference, and it clearly resonated with me at the time in a way that I couldn't understand, but now looking back I totally get it. And it was obviously growing up being different, I guess this was always in the back of my mind, so we have that one. Anyway, then moving on to, I mentioned that in the books that my granddad Bongi made me, there was a duck called Rapunzel and there was various chicks because they were the pets that I had. And that's because I was obsessed with a hand-me-down copy that I had of this from my mum and my aunts and uncles, which is Rapunzel, the Ladybird Well-Loved Tales edition. This is actually a reprint to mark the 100th anniversary in 2015, but I was obsessed with this. We had, where I'm from in Matlock Bath, we had a tower on, well, it's still there. There's a tower on the hill with only like one window, and I literally thought Rapunzel and the witch lived on that hill. I was obsessed with it. We had woods and forests and all sorts. It was a lovely place to grow up. And yeah, I just, all the pictures stay with me forever. Like, I really remember the walled garden with the fresh green salad that the pregnant woman wanted so much, and like climbing over it. And now I have a walled garden that doesn't look far off the one in here, if I can find it now. So yeah, so this book really resonated with me. I don't have a thatched cottage at the end, but I do have a walled garden. And I just loved it, and I read it over and over. And I remember this being the first book that I could really read to myself, and just, yeah, always turning to it, always heading for it. And hence why my first pet, a pet duck, she was amazing, she used to fly to my feet and everything, was called Rapunzel because of this, you see. The images, they just stay with you forever. The witch climbing up her hair. And also, I will say, Tangled is one of my favourites, one of my favourite Disney films. Speaking of Disney, I'm happy to go and see Cruella this evening as this goes live. Anyway, then on to, I guess, the next book up from that in terms of the series. A series that I really got into. I'm not saying that you all have to have got into a series of books if you decide that you want to give this a whirl at any point. But I absolutely loved The Worst Witch, way before HP, way before any other sort of witchy books. For me, The Worst Witch, or wizardy books, this was the original and the best, and it tells of Mildred Hubble, who is, well, she's the worst witch. She's not very good at being a witch, and it's how her and her cat Tabby, who again isn't like the other cats because they're all black cats and he's a tabby cat, it's all about how she kind of fails epically but saves the day. In fact, actually, this could be like a how to fail for youths. I might mention that to Elizabeth Day and see what she thinks. But I absolutely love this. And again, I really love the illustrations, the memories of those. And I was thinking recently, like, maybe I could get like a Mildred Hubble tattoo or something, or would that be possibly a little bit weird? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I love these. I read them, and you know, how could you not enjoy Mildred and Maud disappearing, and Ethel and Mrs. Hardbroom, who I think is like almost an original Mrs. Danvers for me. So yeah, Mrs. Danvers will come up later. Moving on to the next decade. The next decade is the one between the ages of like 11 and 20, where I just sort of fell out of love with reading. But I did have a couple of books that really meant a lot to me. The first of which is The Hound of the Baskervilles, The Hound of the Baskervilles, which, which, this Sherlock Holmes books and stories have become a real favourite in my life, and are a real sort of, if I'm feeling like really ill and really rough, I'll turn to a Sherlock short story. I can't speak. If I'm feeling really rough or really ill, I will turn to a Sherlock Holmes short story. And it's a nostalgic thing. It's the fact that I know I'm just going to enjoy it. And even if I can sometimes remember the outcome, it always still amazes me how we get there. And Hound of the Baskervilles is the first sort of big chunky novel. Now, the reason that I've got into Sherlock Holmes and his short stories, because my great uncle Derek, who's sadly no longer with us, he would memorise Sherlock Holmes stories and other Arthur Conan Doyle stories, to be fair, tales of mystery and unease. And he would memorise for 2 a day when we went on walking holidays. And that's because I would go with my gran, my bongie, my great uncle Derek and my great auntie Pat, and we would do these sort of the Dale's Way, or I'm trying to think for the ones that we did. We did lots of different Offers Dyke, and they were like 11 miles a day-ish. And so I would sort of flag before lunch and sort of flag as the evening went on. And that is when he would tell me these stories, which he'd memorised word for word for me. My Uncle Derek was a legend. Although he did have one bad bookish habit, which he would buy a second-hand book of a copy he already had, and he would tear the pages as he went and throw them away so that his packing got lighter. I don't think that's the right way to do it, but it's how he did it, and he was a delight, and I forgive him for that paper massacre. Anyway, yeah, so he would memorise these stories, and my gran always used to say that she and my Auntie Pat and Bong would always try and catch up so that they could hear the stories too, and they didn't miss anything. So they have always stayed with me, and this, I think, also was my first taste, particularly with Baskervilles, of the real Gothic, and I just loved it. Right, next, I realise I'm taking longer at doing this than I thought I would, but that's always the case with me, because waffles, tangents, and the whole shebang. A book that definitely made me in many, many ways, and I don't have the first one, I don't know why, but it's Tales of the City by Armistead Maupin, which tells of San Francisco and Marianne Singleton, when she arrives, being a bit of a country bumpkin, getting there and sort of ending up living in this shared house with all these quirky, amazing, wonderful, queer characters, and the sort of adventures that surround them all, the love stories that surround them all, the trysts, the love triangles, the tribulations, the trials, everything is in these, and they're just wonderful. They were a chronicle in the newspaper in San Francisco when they were originally written, and people just got grip with them, very much actually like Sherlock Holmes. And yeah, I think this was the first time I realised that there were people out there in the world that were like me, queer people, and they were having happy lives, and it was brimming with friendships and all that kind of stuff. And the postman's here. That was rather apt, actually, the postman bringing me more books, as I'm doing a video talking about all the books that shaped my life. Right, I also found a bit ago, I got a little bit emotional talking about like my great uncle Derek and Bongi and Gran, because they're just not here anymore, and it's really sad. You know, I'd love to share stories about books now with them. Anyway, right, moving on. So yeah, Tales of the City, really, really important book for me. Made me feel like I wasn't going to be alone as I grew up, which was kind of the narrative around gay men back in the sort of early 90s. I also should mention, though, A Boy's Own Story by Edmund White would also kind of be up there with this, but I think... No, do you know what? It wouldn't quite. It was very important for me, but I think that's why I turned to this one, because this also is a book that feels like whenever I pick it up again, it's like I'm hanging out with friends, and at some point I would like to read the entire the entire series again to get lost in all of their stories. I should also say I've had the pleasure of hosting events with Armistead at Maupin and having dinner with him, and he is an absolute delight, which I think made me love the books even more, because he is an embodiment of them. Anyway, there we go. So there's that. And then the first book that my mum gave me as kind of my first grown-up book to read, I guess, is one that has really, really made me in a lot of ways. And again, it's quite Gothic, possibly an understatement. It's a story of a murder, quite literally, in the title, and it's Perfume by Patrick Suskind. And yeah, I just became so engrossed in this book, and I couldn't quite believe that there could be, even like having read Sherlock Holmes and stuff, this is like next level of sort of thriller, I guess, or literary thriller, in the fact that it's about a man who wants to create a perfume that matches people's skin, and how he goes about that is quite awful. I don't really love the film, I have to say, but the book I think is phenomenal. And this actually I think I must have read when I was about 14, 15, so probably actually weirdly one of the first books I read that was kind of my first grown-up book, and yet actually was just before I stopped reading for a long time. So between the ages of 16 and I think it's about 23, 24, I didn't pick up a book. But that is a perfect segue, and actually a Gothic segue, into my next decade. So my 20s to my 30s. And the book that got me back into reading with a bang, is well documented on this channel, so I feel like I don't need to talk about it for too long, is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which was one of 3 books that my friend Polly, who I've known since I was 4, gave me when I was going to have an operation, and I hadn't read for years. I was really put off by reading at school. I had a really bad English teacher, and yeah, I just didn't care for it. I also quit my A-levels and decided to become a hairdresser, and my A-levels English literature, and I just wasn't fussed about it at all. I thought it was elitist. I didn't see the joy in it. I felt like it was like a task rather than something to do to relax, etc., until I had this operation. Now, the other 2 books that she gave me, which I should mention, are The Surgeon by Tess Gerritsen, which is about a psychopathic surgeon, just when I was having an operation. And the other one was The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie, which I read after this. And I think it was a combination of those 3 that really got me, but it was definitely this that stole my heart. And yeah, you all know the tale of Rebecca. I feel like I don't need to say it. It's about a woman who marries, she meets Maxim de Winter in Casablanca. They go back to Mandalay, his home, where he lived with his first wife, Rebecca, who died. And there is Mrs. Danvers, who keeps the ghost very much alive of Rebecca. Yeah, it follows on from there. And I think it's a gorgeous, glorious Gothic masterpiece. And I have to say, I don't know if it's my favourite Daphne du Maurier now, which is interesting, although I think you always remember your first, oi oi. But for me, this is a book that, without this book, I wouldn't be doing this channel. I wouldn't read as much as I do. It just wouldn't have happened. I genuinely think this gave me such a kick start. Now, going on to something quite different is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And we're going back to my gran now. And this is one of the several books that, when I went to go and stay with her once in my sort of mid to late 20s, we got trapped by some really big storms. And I hadn't brought any books with me, or maybe I had brought one that I thought wouldn't get much time to read, but we were literally stuck in. So I finished that book and I said, oh, I fancy reading something else. And this was the first of the books of hers that she recommended me. I've held it up for ages. I think I've said it's In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And this is the first narrative non-fiction I read, and the one book that kind of showed me that non-fiction wasn't academic and boring, and instead was gripping and vivid and visceral. And actually this made me cry when we get to the specific murder scene involved. So yeah, I just thought this was amazing. This is actually my gran's first edition that I inherited after she died. So it means a lot to me in that sense as well. But this is the book that opened me up to heading into non-fiction and trying books that I wouldn't normally have. And the other book that she gave me that week was Maggie O'Farrell's The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox, which is another absolute favourite of mine. So Maggie became one of my favourite authors. Now, this book I remember being my first introduction to the Women's Prize, I think, although it could have actually been on Beauty by Zadie Smith, which might not have been the best introduction, but this is the one where I sort of really started to learn about what the Women's Prize was. So that was a joy to it. And ironically, I realised the other week that the person who bought me this was my mum, and it was when I was living in London. She'd come to visit, and I wasn't earning masses, so books were still a real treat. And we went through Foyles, I think it was, and it might have been Blackwell's, or it might have been both, actually, knowing us. And she let me pick 3 books. It must have been both, because she let me pick three I'm getting so excited thinking about it. She let me pick 3 books from each of those bookshops on Charing Cross Road back when Blackwell's was on there. And I remember one of them was David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, which I didn't really get on with. But the one that I did get on with, and the one that opened me up to, I think, something that's become a real favourite thing of mine in fiction, is discovering about parts of the world I don't know anything about, but also parts of history there that I don't know anything about. And the book is Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Now, I know some people have certain thoughts on the author. I'm just telling you my honest journey through books, so I didn't know any of that at the time. This would have been when I was probably, 26, 27? So we are talking quite a long time ago, because I am quite old. Yeah, I just completely and utterly fell in love with this book. And I think it was also a book that set me off on a path to read much more Nigerian fiction, which is, it's not a genre, is it? But I do love Nigerian fiction, and I think that love has come from this. But also I've got those memories of it being the book that, like I said, first got me into the Women's Prize, which obviously I've become a huge fan of and love doing all the videos with my mum. And then I remembered it was my mum that got me it. So what a lovely twist of fate, or what a lovely circular something or other. So then on to my 30s to my 40s, and I'm not 40 yet, I'm 40 next year. But this selection of books is probably the biggest because it has seen the most growth in my reading. And I mean, I will say, from reading Rebecca onwards, I started to buy books in ridiculous amounts. We had a charity shop at the end of our road when I lived in London, where it was 5 books for £2, and that shop is actually partly responsible for a lot of the books on those shelves, for definite, which I've then carried around with me for over a decade since. So I was really, really into reading, but I do remember, and I know this was after I was 30 because it was after me and my first husband split up, and I decided when I moved to Manchester that I'd kind of, divorce is horrible and awful, But there is one weird thing about it, which you sort of slowly realise, and that is that you are free to do whatever you want and that life is yours and you can take it whatever direction you want to. And I knew that I wanted to work more in books if I could. And one of those things that I really, really wanted to do was to run book events. And so, along with Adam Lowe, who was a friend of mine when I moved to, one of the first friends that I made when I moved to Manchester, we decided to set up a literary salon called Bookmarked. I should mention here, Damien Barr was so helpful. He runs Damien Barr's literary salon now, and has done for all that time. He's amazing. But he gave me loads of tips and was just wonderful. And the first two guests we had were S.J. Watson, to talk about Before I Go to Sleep, his debut, which then went boom, which was really exciting, and an author who's become a favourite author of mine and also made me realise when I did the live the other day talking all sorts of things about being on BookTube in the last 5 years, that I hadn't started reading them 5 years ago because I was 30 a lot longer than 5 years ago. Well, 4 years longer than 5 years ago. And this author has become an absolute favourite of mine. It's Sarah Winman, When God Was a Rabbit. And what a pairing to get your first ever literary salon. I mean, it was bonkers. And I remember being really worried that nobody was going to turn up. Mum visited and she was worried nobody was going to turn up. And we had over 100 people in the audience and it was just amazing. And it was like, I remember just feeling so like, oh my God, we made this happen. We did this. And I have to say Waterstones in Manchester were brilliant partners and everything. So yeah, it was just, that is a real moment for my career, it felt like. Even though back then I didn't think it would, like books would be my career. I didn't think that was possible. I certainly didn't in my 20s when I wasn't reading them. Anyway, so there we go. Then on to two books that made me change my opinion about... three books actually that made me change my opinion about genres or types of books that I read. So first up is, after having read In Cold Blood and really, really loving that and kind of being open to narrative non-fiction, that's what I binged on. I didn't really try anything else. However, not that many years ago, in my BookTube history, in fact, so in the last 5 years, I have read The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which I think is one of the most incredible novels about queerness, queer family, gender, bodies, just everything, acceptance, all those things. And it's the sort of book, and I said this when I first read it, where it's almost like Maggie Nelson takes the top of your head off, pours all these ideas in, and then pops the lid back on, shakes it and says, go away and have a good think about that. And you do. I just think it's phenomenal. It was also kind of the first time I really got into vignette writing. And yeah, I still think utterly incredible, and sort of opened me up to how non-fiction, not just in terms of narrative non-fiction, but in this kind of vignette-y, quirky, different way, can open your mind to so many more experiences than, fiction can. I think it's wonderful, but I never felt like that about non-fiction. It always felt to me like either I could read it and it was a really good story, narrative non-fiction wise, or it was academic and I wasn't interested. And this opened me up to the other almost endless possibilities of non-fiction, which was fabulous. And then I find this quite interesting, like looking back on my reading life, again, not in an egotistical way, but just in the fact that, like, clearly when I started reading as sort of a young teen, before I then stopped for ages, I was trying to find myself in fiction, or reading fiction that had sort of mirroring or shades of myself in, both to kind of put myself in context of the world, I guess, but also just in terms of finding myself, and also finding the fiction that worked for me. And then once I'd read not all of that, because you can't read all of that sort of fiction, but once I read a lot of that sort of fiction, I moved on to wanting to be in the footsteps of other people and experiencing all different walks of life all over the world that were nothing like mine. And I think that's why now I read less queer fiction than I used to, because I'm just a bit like, less gay male fiction than I used to, because I'm just a bit like, I kind of know quite a bit about that, although admittedly not, I'm in a very privileged white space within that, and there are lots of people who aren't, and lots of stories that I need to read about those that I haven't, but more possibly on that in a little bit. But what I realised that I was struggling with was poetry, and the only other poetry collection I'd like before this one I'm going to mention is Gargling with Jelly by Brian Patton. Who else read this? I mean, I can still literally say word for what's the word? I can literally read, or I still have the poem Pick a Nose Pick memorized in my brain. I'm not going to do it now because it's a bit gross, but that was also what was so brilliant about this poetry collection. Anyway, that's back to old me reading this, or older or younger but older times reading. The collection that really got me back into poetry, or has really got me back into poetry in the last 5 years, is Andrew Macmillan's Physical. And yes, that does mean I get to show you a cheeky little cheeky bottom cheek. I'll show you this. This poetry collection is just amazing. It's about masculinity, bodies, but also the queer body and queer masculinity and toxic masculinity, and all of those things involved, rolled into one. And I just think it is brilliant. His latest collection, actually Pandemonium's just arrived, so I'm very much, which I bought from Waterstones, which I'm very much excited to read. But yeah, I just think this is one of the best poetry collections I've ever read, and can't recommend it enough. I will link all of these books down below, by the way. So yeah, so that opened me up to poetry, and I have to say, I feel like with poetry, I'm still on that journey where I'm reading a lot of queer poetry, and I really get that, and that's helping me to step to the next stuff, which is a little bit more outside my comfort zone. So there we go. Speaking of comfort zones, a book that I ended up reading because I love Australian fiction. I've got a real thing about Australia. I feel like when I finally go there, I'm just going to feel at home. I don't know where this has come from, but it's how I feel. It's very much how I feel about North Wales, although North Wales I'm much more likely to actually move to. Australia, I think I'd just like, in my dream scenario, I'd like to be able to live there maybe 4 or 5 months a year, North Wales the rest. Anyway, this book from Australia only very recently made me realise that I don't know my taste as well as I think I do, and I need to try more genres. Haven't done very well since I read it, but it did make me feel all of those things, and that's kind of coming to the fore at the moment. I've been talking about that a bit in other videos, but it is From the Wreck by Jane Rawson, which also is the first book I ever got a cover quote on, so it means it loads to me for that too. But that was way after I'd read it. So this is a book all about a man who's on a boat where he sees this kind of woman who's really, really drawn to. There's a crash. They're together, and then when they get saved, they're separated, and she disappears, and he searches for her and can't find her. We realise it's because she's turned into a cat, because she is kind of an alien life force, and then it's how they sort of stay in touch without him knowing going forward. It's so brilliantly done. It's unlike anything I've ever read before. It's kind of historical fiction with a sci-fi twist, basically, and it has reminded me that I must try books outside my comfort zone much more often. I haven't been as good at it, although actually now I think I try a lot more books now, and actually I did a whole video on this which I'll link down below. I was like, how do I know my reading taste anymore, or what kind of reader I am? I feel like I've lost that a little bit, and I think that's because I'm reading much more widely than I've ever done before. Penultimately, a book that I only read very recently that reminded me of the power of fiction for us to walk in other people's shoes, or to experience the lives of others we might not. And I think quite a lot of books I read tend to do that in history, but not necessarily right now. And this is a book that is about right now, that everyone should be reading right now. And it is Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. This book has been talked about a lot this year. It is brilliant. Now I have to say, and I think this is the case with some of these books, it's not the best book I've ever read. It's not the best book I've ever read, or the best book ever written. But what this does about giving you so much insight into what it's like to be trans and the trans community and queer families and all those things is just incredible. And that is what I kind of want to keep reading going forward. I want to find out even more about what it's like to be other people, so that I can know more, be a better ally, and just have more awareness outside the sort of, I think I'm an ally. This taught me that I could be a better ally. That's what I mean. And those are the sort of books that I need. So there's this one. And last but not least, and this is really because this only happened this weekend, I fell in love with this book a year or two ago. It's On the Red Hill by Mike Parker. And this book, and I think this is probably what I'm wanting going forward a little bit more. It's not going to be that easy because there's not many books that are written about a place that you can stay in, because I did go and stay on the Red Hill this weekend just gone, and there'll be a vlog of that coming in the next week or so. And this book is about a couple, Mike and Preds, who inherited a house off another gay couple who had been together for decades before homosexuality was legalised in rural Wales. They were the first couple to get married in gay couple to get married in Wales, and it looks at what it's like to be queer out in the rural sort of wilderness, but also about sort of what it's a whole history of a couple and their lives and all the things that happened in history along the way, plus this relationship between the two couples. And there's so much in here. And then to actually go there and experience what a magical place it is, which you feel in the book, and feel the history there and everything, it was just incredible. I know this isn't going to be an experience that's going to happen again like often, but I would love more experiences like this. We're going to be going back because I loved it so much. We're going to be going back in September. But yeah, so that book, and again, that book's bubbled with me, and then suddenly come to the fore with with going there this weekend and everything. And yeah, So there we go. Those are the books that have made me. It's going to be interesting to see maybe in like a decade, if I'm still doing YouTube videos, then what like the next decade is going to be full of. Hopefully more books like the ones particularly in the recent years that just kind of moved me on as a reader, I guess, if that makes sense. So there we go. Please do have a go at this and link it below if you do it, letting me, know, or sorry, sharing with everyone, but then letting me know the books that have made you over different decades. I would just absolutely love to see that from more of you. So yeah, on that note, this video is longer than I meant it to be, so I'm going to go, but I will see you tomorrow for the final of my 5 days of videos to celebrate my 5th BookTube birthday, which is going to be the 25 best books I have read in the last 5 years. That was a tough decision. More on that tomorrow. Bye.